Chapter 51, A Race Against Time. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Marcellus gazed upon the city of Ravenna with a bitter smile on his face. His army was close to arriving at the gates of the city. The capital of the Western Roman Empire was a far cry from what it had been in centuries past. Having been moved from Rome to Ravenna, the current capital only existed because of its secure location. Located in a swamp, it was difficult to lay siege to the city, especially for most of Rome's enemies. However, Marcellus was determined to break down the gates, and put an end to the false emperor Honorius. Because of this, he wasted no time as he gave his soldiers their orders. Set up a siege camp, and prepare the battering ram, the catapults, and the ladders. I want an assault on these walls within 3 days. The soldiers beneath Marcellus' command grumbled as they fulfilled their orders. They had one chance to eliminate Honorius and his sycophantic followers, and they would not stop until they achieved their goals, or died trying. Marcellus sat beside his highest-ranking officers, sighing heavily as he gazed upon the scene of the city. If his mother was still alive, she was being held captive in the palace dungeons. After all, she was Honorius' prisoner. He did not dare to think about what torment she had received by Honorius and his men. Only one thing was certain in the mind of Marcellus. He planned to kill every man who took up arms for Honorius. Had the fool not taken his mother prisoner and subjected her to unspeakable torture, then perhaps he would spare the lives of the soldiers. However, they were equally guilty for defending the man and his actions. Thus Marcellus planned to sack the city, and butcher every man who fought for the opposing side. While Marcellus established his siege camp in the vicinity of Ravenna, Placidia and the guards who had plotted to help Aeliana were on the move. The city was in an uproar. An army of 30,600 men stood outside their gates. They were setting up camp and building siege weapons. With only a few thousand defenders, the inhabitants of the capital knew they could not last long. However, it was too late for anyone to flee. Under Olympus' orders, the garrison dispatched all soldiers to the walls and had sealed all exits. By doing this, the garrison been stretched thin. As a result, they had even reduced the security detail that guarded Aeliana to 1 man so that the others could protect the walls. This man just so happened to be on the side of the conspirators. Aeliana had lifeless eyes as she heard the footsteps of a small host of men approach her cell. She had been physically and sexually abused for the past few months by her captors. She had even heard rumors that her son was marching an army to liberate her. However, she had no hope. She did not want her precious baby boy to risk his life just because of her. If she weren't such a coward, she would have already bitten her tongue off. Suddenly a candle lit the area, and a group of men Aeliana was not familiar with approached her cell. Along their side was Placidia, who rushed to the door of the cell and demanded the key from the man who was guarding it. The key, now. The man did as he was ordered, and gave the young woman the key to the cell's door, which she quickly used to open it. With a worried expression on her face, Placidia approached Aeliana and wrapped her arms around her. The woman was totally defeated, and despite this, Placidia did her best to lead her to safety. Just you wait, Aeliana, I'm getting you out of here, and delivering you to your son. With any hope, we can save this city from Marcellus' wrath. Aeliana did not respond to Placidia's words. In fact, she was so weak that she had to be carried out of the cell by the guards. With sufficient skill in stealth, the deserters, along with Placidia, exited the palace. Apparently Honorius was nowhere to be found in this time of chaos, not that anyone really cared. The true power behind the throne was none other than Olympus. After leaving the palace, Placidia and her crew decided to wait until nightfall before making any significant moves and were quick to hide themselves from any possible pursuers. They ended up finding a spot in a dark corner of the city. It was not wise to move around the city at the moment. Numerous guards ran around and screamed various things. It was evident that the city's defenders were panicking about the army that had approached. God damn it. Why the hell did our damned emperor have to go and massacre the families of these Goths? They should have been on our side. Another soldier scolded the man for his comments as the two of them rushed by Placidia's hiding place, not even aware of the group's presence. Does it really matter now? Get your ass on the wall and prepare for battle. It seems that the enemy has no intentions to negotiate. I heard the messenger that the Magister Militum sent had his head removed. The soldiers bantered amongst themselves as they passed by Placidia. And the others? It was only after they were gone that they could sigh in relief. One of the guards who had assisted Placidia in her efforts whispered in a voice so low that the girl nearly missed what he had said. It will take Marcellus and his soldiers a few days to construct the siege weapons required to assault the city's gates. We have no food, no shelter, and we are now fugitives. The moment Honorius learns his prisoner has escaped, he will send men after us. I doubt we will be able to escape the city until the siege truly begins. Placidia's heart shrank as she heard this. She was not an expert on sieges, and did not expect that they would have to wait a few days until the fighting began. She was panicking at this moment as she searched for ideas. Well, what the hell are we supposed to do? Winter is near, and we will freeze if we do not find some shelter for the night. The group remained silent for some time, pondering about a solution to their problem, until one guard remembered something from his childhood, which he felt was relevant. I don't know if this helps, but I know of an old and abandoned entrance to the cisterns. I used to play down there as a kid with my friends. If we were to hide there, it should keep us safe for a few days. We would also have all the fresh water we could want. Food is a more difficult issue, but I'm sure we can find something to eat. With no better option, the group agreed to the suggestion. They waited until the moon was high above in the sky before carefully gliding past patrols, while making sure that they were not being followed. Unfortunately, things did not always go as planned, and a patrol spotted the group about halfway to their destination. You there? Why are you not at your posts? Don't you see there is an army is at our gates? Placidia and the crew froze on the spot as several soldiers approached their position. The leader of the guards who assisted the emperor's sister tried to bullshit his way through the scenario. Unfortunately he was not a very good liar. We are just assisting some injured civilians to a safe location. While it was clear that Aeliana was injured, there wasn't a scratch on Placidia, and because of this doubt rose through the minds of the interrogator. However, before he could even react, Placidia gritted her teeth and unsheathed the blade that one of her guards kept on his waist, slashing at the throat of the nearest hostile. Before the man could react, his neck was cut open, and he quickly collapsed to the floor where he bled out. The other soldiers were too shocked to scream for assistance. Taking advantage of this, those who supported Placidia quickly tackled the patrol, and ended their lives as silently as possible. With a hand over their mouths and a blade to the neck. In a matter of seconds, the Roman patrol was slaughtered in an alleyway. As a result, the leader of the guards, who were allied with Placidia, chewed the girl out. What the hell were you thinking? We could have talked our way out of it. The garrison is going to know if one of their patrols goes missing. Placidia did not hear a thing the man had said, instead she panted heavily as she gazed towards her blood-stained hands. She had acted entirely on instinct, and in the process, killed a man. She had never killed a man before, hell her heart was too fragile to even harm a rabbit. Yet she had so ruthlessly taken this man's life. She began to have an existential crisis on the spot. While Placidia was freaking out about her vicious actions, the guards hid the bodies to the best of their ability. Eventually, the corpses of this patrol would be found, and when that happened, they would lead a trail to where Placidia and the others were hiding. It was now a race against time. Would Honorius be able to find his runaway sister and his missing captive? Or would Marcellus begin the assault and distract the garrison long enough for the group to escape? Only time would tell. Chapter 52 For the Glory of Rome. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Honorius was trembling with rage as he stared at Olympus, who was bowing his head before him. His plan was to use Aeliana to compel Marcellus to cease his rebellion. However, that had now gone up in smoke, as his prisoner was missing, and so too was his sister. He did not know how the clever girl had escaped her confinement and released Aeliana from her cell, but she had accomplished it. Naturally, being the fool that he was, Honorius did not reflect on his own actions that led to this point, and instead pinned the blame for the incident on Olympus, who had recently fallen out of favor with the indolent emperor after learning that the man's actions had caused his foederati to flee to Marcellus' side. Olympus, you fool! How could you leave nobody behind to guard Aeliana? Also, what the hell happened to my sister's escort? They are both missing, and nobody seems to know where they are. As we speak, my city is surrounded by the rebels, and Marcellus will begin his assault by tomorrow morning. Just what do you have to say for yourself? Olympus struggled to maintain his composure. Honorius was a self-entitled brat who was getting on the man's nerves. However, Olympus still needed his puppet alive and content if he wished to rule over the empire, and because of this, he did not resort to anger, and instead calmly explained his understanding of what had happened. I don't know the details myself, your majesty. I left behind a single man to guard Aeliana's cell. After all, our forces are stretched thin across the city's defense, and I needed to draft capable men wherever I could find them. It is my belief that the guard somehow conspired with your sister, and helped her flee the palace with your prisoner. I assure you that my forces are searching for the girl as we speak. Luckily, the hounds have her scent, and it will not take long before we find the girl. I assure you that you will have your prisoner back under your control before the rebels assaults the city's defenses. Honorius was not one who knew when to give up, and thus he quickly voiced his frustrations at the whole situation. Utterly incompetent. When Stilicho was still my magister militum, he never would have allowed things to reach this point. Being compared with his old political rival, even after man's death, struck a nerve in Olympus' mind and he could no longer contain his fury. He quickly reminded the emperor that Stilicho was no longer present with a venomous tongue. Stilicho was a traitor, and you removed his head because of it. Meanwhile, I have only ever been loyal to you. I suggest you keep that in mind while I win your war for you. Honorius could only click his tongue in displeasure as he heard these words. He had no response, for his mind was not clever enough to come up with a witty retort. All he could do was throw a tantrum like a child, which naturally he did. I don't care what means you use. I want my prisoner returned to me, and my sister kneeling before me in tears. Just make sure she's still eligible to be wed. I will need her to secure alliances in the future. Upon hearing that he had been given free rein, Olympus' lips curved into a cruel smile as he bowed his head once more before responding to his orders. As you command. After saying this, he departed from the royal palace, leaving Honorius by his lonesome. The overgrown child simply drank his wine and returned his attention to more petty matters. So what if an army of rebels were outside his gates trying to claim his head? Until they got past Ravenna's mighty defenses, such things were not the slightest bit of his concern. Instead, he deluded himself into believing that his forces could hold out against Marcellus and his army, and perhaps even defeat them. Marcellus, I will have you groveling on your knees before me by the time this siege is over. I have tolerated your insolence for too long. Placidia, Aeliana, and the 3 guards had made their way to the cisterns where they currently hid in the shadows. Though they had a fresh water supply, they were utterly lacking in food. It was because of this that their bellies grumbled in the darkness. As for Aeliana, she had not been fed well during her captivity, and was practically a withering husk. The emperor's sister did her best as she cupped her hands into the pool of water and used it to feed the emaciated woman. She wore a pretty smile, despite being aware of the severity of the woman's condition, while prodding her to drink. Aeliana, just a little longer and you will be reunited with your son. However, you need to drink, please, for Marcellus. The woman had a lifeless expression on her face, as if the months of captivity and torment had completely eroded her soul. She was alive physically, but mentally it was as if she had already perished. Still, There was barely enough thought left in her mind to comprehend what the girl had said, and because of that, she slurped down the cool, fresh water. When Placidia saw this, a smile broke out on her face as she continued to feed the woman fresh water, hoping that it could improve her physical condition. At this rate, even if Aeliana's life was spared, and she was returned to her son's arms, Marcellus was still liable to burn the city in his wrath. Placidia knew that there were few things in this world that could compel a rational man like Marcellus to such brutality, and harming his loved ones was one of those conditions. Honorius had truly made a mistake. If he had just captured Aeliana and placed her under house arrest like he had done to his sister, then perhaps Marcellus would be merciful. However, with the current state of the woman, even if she survived, she would be scarred for life. Placidia actually thought death would be a mercy for Aeliana as she gazed upon the state the woman was in, but she was determined to reunite Aeliana with her son, even if her life faded away the moment after. While Placidia was feeding Aeliana with the fresh water, a noise reacted outside the cisterns. Though it wasn't exceedingly close, it was loud enough to alert the fugitives hiding within the caverns. The sound itself was the howl of hounds, who had picked up the scent of their location. The terrifying noise made the men and women who hid within the cisterns shiver in fright. Knowing that their time was coming to an end, the leader of the guards unsheathed his blade. When Placidia saw this, she immediately questioned his sanity. "What are you thinking? We cannot fight the hounds, they will tear us to pieces." Despite knowing this, the guards were determined to buy Placidia and Aeliana some time. He quickly asked about the prisoner's condition while refusing to gaze behind him. "Can you carry her to safety?" Placidia understood what he was asking in that instant and gulped the saliva that had pooled in her mouth. She nodded her head before responding to the man's question. I believe that I can." After hearing this, a bitter smile formed on the leader of the guards' faces who gave the girl an order. "Placidia, it has been the honor of a lifetime to assist you in your escape. However, I fear that this is where we must part ways. I will do my best to buy you some time. If you follow the path of the cisterns, it will lead towards an exit near the city's gates. I'm afraid how you manage to leave the city will be up to your imagination." Upon seeing their leader so determined, the other two men quickly unsheathed their swords in resistance. They would not let the man fight by his lonesome. Tears streamed down the girl's eyes as she realized the price these men were about to pay for her and Aeliana. They had already sacrificed so much in this escape attempt, and now they were going to pay for their bravery with their lives. To be ruthlessly torn apart by hounds, that was not a fate Placidia would wish on even her worst enemies. She quickly lifted Aeliana into her hands, who were practically skin and bones, and ran off, leaving behind one last phrase of encouragement. "I will never forget what you have all done for me. I promise that when I escape this city and reunite Aeliana with her son, I will make sure musicians sing songs about your last stand for generations to come." The leader of the guards merely laughed as he prepared himself for his death. The men by his side were quick to join him. They may not have been men who had served on the front lines of war, nor had they gained any major accolades for themselves as members of the Emperor's Guard. However, they were determined to fight until their last breath to ensure that Placidia and Aeliana safely escaped their predicament. Shortly thereafter, the hounds entered the cisterns barking towards their masters that they had caught up to the scent. In a last stand, the three palace guards charged towards the hounds with swords in hand, shouting the words that would be remembered in history. "For the glory of Rome." Chapter 53 Wrath of an Emperor. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Having escaped from the cisterns, Placidia held Aeliana in her arms. Despite being a teenage girl, it was not too difficult to lift the woman. She had lost so much weight since her captivity that even someone like Placidia, who did not exercise in the slightest, was capable of carrying her to safety. Unfortunately, their guard had stayed behind to deal with the hounds, and if the blood-curdling screams that had recently vanished were anything to go by, they were likely already dead. Tears streamed down Placidia's eyes as she mustered all her strength to carry the woman out of the city and to her son. who was sitting outside the city's gates besieging it as she pondered these thoughts within her young mind. She would not accept any other outcome than reuniting Marcellus with his mother. Because of this, she strode through the streets, with the woman in her arms, trying desperately to hide from the patrols that were out and about searching for the two women. Placidia was not too familiar with Ravenna as she normally lived in Rome. However, she and her men had prepared this escape thoroughly, and had listed a series of posterns that they could hopefully make use of to escape. Unfortunately, they were relying on the 3 guards to ambush and defeat the security at the postern of their choosing. Now, Placidia would have to rely on a distraction. As a result, when she neared the postern that she had marked as being the least secure during her preparations, she placed Aeliana in a safe and hidden location. She had no choice but to cause a disturbance if she wanted the 3 men who were guarding the area to run off. Luckily for her, they had planned a contingency in case something went wrong and they didn't have enough men to capture the postern. Near this postern was a warehouse filled with the city's grain. If she were to light it on fire, it would draw all men within the vicinity. Because of this, the young woman stealthily approached the grain silo, which was protected by only a few men. As with any siege, those posted in seemingly safe locations were busy drinking and gambling. Because of this, they did not notice the girl's approach. Placidia could see the oil lamp in use by the Roman sentries to illuminate their game. This was the object that she needed to light the grain supply. Unfortunately, she did not know how she would get her hands on the item in question. Perhaps God was on her side, because immediately after thinking of this, one man stumbled to his feet. It was clear that he was heavily intoxicated. Because of this, his fellow sentries immediately called out to him with a hint of worry. "What the hell are you doing?" In response to this, the sentry made a rude gesture before fumbling over his words. "I'm about to piss myself." The other 2 soldiers laughed at the man while one of them handed him the oil lamp. "You stupid drunk, take this, or else you're bound to fall into a pool of your own urine." The man tried to shake off the request, but his friends were adamant. As such, he held onto the oil lantern in one hand, and used the other to press against the wall, thus stabilizing him on his journey to find a spot to relieve himself. While the man was in the middle of letting out a stream, Placidia approached him from behind with a heavy rock in her hands. The man was completely clueless that he was about to be ambushed. Before he could even react, the girl had smashed the rock into the man's head and thoroughly knocked him unconscious. After doing so, she seized the lantern before throwing it into the grain warehouse's window. The grain immediately caught fire from the burning oil, which alarmed the sentries. "Oi! What the fuck did you do? Fucking dumbass! How the hell did you manage to light the warehouse on fire? Somebody help!" The men quickly investigated the scene, but all they found was their comrade lying unconscious in a pool of his own urine, with the warehouse lit on fire. As for Placidia, she had long since absconded into the darkness. The flames quickly spread, consuming the city's grain supply, while the soldiers at the postern quickly ran off to aid in putting out the fire. Placidia knew this was the opportune moment, and grabbed a hold of Aeliana, who was lying with a lifeless expression on her gaunt face, and dragged her off to the postern, where she quickly unlocked and exited, leaving the gate open as she did so. A smile was on the girl's face as she comforted the woman in her arms. "Just you wait, Placidia, you will be reunited with Marcellus soon enough." While Placidia was enacting her escape from Ravenna, Marcellus was hard at work. Unlike the Romans under Olympus' command, Marcellus was extremely strict about the use of alcohol while on campaign. As a result, his men were stone-cold sober as they kept watch during the night. Marcellus himself was in his command tent with his officers nearby, planning out the siege that would take place on the next day. "I expect Honorius will use my mother as a bargaining token. However, I have already executed his messenger. If my mother is still alive, she has suffered dearly over these past few months, and is as good as dead. No, I will not negotiate. Tomorrow at dawn we will begin our bombardment. The catapults we have constructed will launch their projectiles into the city. The battering ram will crash at the gate, and our men will ascend the ladders and onto the ramparts. This siege is simple. We have 10 times the men that Honorius has, so we will use our numerical advantage to storm the city as quickly as possible. Any questions? Not a single officer gathered in the room had questioned Marcellus' orders. A frontal assault would be costly, but it would be the quickest way to take the city. They were about to agree to the proposed plan, when the tent flaps opened, revealing a centurion who had a panicked expression on his face. The man did not wait for the generals to inquire about his disruption and instead stated what the scouts had reported. Emperor Marcellus, the city's grain supply is on fire, and the postern is open. We don't know who is responsible, but an opportunity has presented itself. Marcellus was a man who could adapt to the circumstances. If they did not take advantage of this situation, they would have to risk losing thousands of men tomorrow morning. He was decisive in his action, believing even if Olympus and Honorius were planning a trap, that he and his soldiers could easily overcome it. Quickly, wake the men, and prepare them for combat. Ordius, I want you to take our most elite soldiers and secure the postern. Once you have taken it, infiltrate the city and open the gates. We must act fast. Succeed in this endeavor and we can take the city with minimal losses. Ordius saluted Marcellus and nodded his head before responding in the affirmative. Yes, sir. After saying this, Ordius scrambled his men, and quickly led them to the postern. With any luck, they could sneak into the city and act as normal members of Honorius' army. By the time they struck, it would be too late for the enemy to adequately respond. As for Marcellus, he quickly gathered the troops in silence. His actions needed to be covert to not alert the sentries of the loyalist army who stood upon the ramparts. It was during this time that another group of scouts had encountered Placidia and Aeliana and led them into the encampment. They quickly found Marcellus rallying the army, where the man gazed in awe upon witnessing his foster sister and his mother. Because both Marcellus and Placidia were both raised by Stilicho, the man thought of the girl as the little sister he had never had. To see her clutching his emaciated mother in her arms nearly brought the man to tears. He quickly rushed over and grabbed hold of his mother, where the woman gazed at her son in disbelief. She was so feeble she could hardly speak. Marcellus, is that you? By now Marcellus was choking back his tears, and instead wore a bitter smile on his face as he stroked the woman's greasy hair. Yes, mother, it's me. What have they done to you? A slight smile curved itself upon the woman's gaunt lips as she weakly reached up her hand and caressed her precious son's warm cheek. There was a hint of sorrow in her eyes as she spoke to him. I'm sorry, Marcellus. I have caused you so much trouble, and I'm afraid. I'm afraid that I will be leaving you behind to clean up the mess. Marcellus could no longer hold back the tears as he called out to his mother, who was dying in his arms. No, mother, I'm sorry, I should have protected you. Mother, don't leave me. The woman said one last phrase before shutting her eyes for eternity. I love you. After saying this, Aeliana passed from the world, leaving her son and Placidia in tears. Placidia quickly grabbed hold of Marcellus' side and attempted to comfort him, but by now rage had consumed the man's mind. Marcellus shook Placidia away before letting go of his mother's, where the body was quickly tended to by his troops. Marcellus merely wiped the tears from his eyes and gazed towards the city of Ravenna with a hatred that burned brighter than 1,000 stars. In that moment, he made a solemn vow on how he would deal with the city of Ravenna and all the men who still stood guard. I'm going to kill them all, every last one of them. History shall remember this day, as the day Emperor Titus Claudius Marcellus rose to power, and purged the capital of its corruption. Hear my orders. Every last man who swears his loyalty to Honorius shall be given no quarter. Kill them all. With Marcellus' orders, the soldiers beneath his command unsheathed their blades and shouted their war cries. The siege of Ravenna had only now just begun, and the wrath of an emperor would resound throughout history. Chapter 54 Fall of Ravenna. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Marcellus was enraged, more so than he had ever been in his life. His mother, who had cared for him by her lonesome since he was a small boy, was dead, and he was to blame. Truthfully, he embarked on this journey knowing that the woman was as good as dead, but that did not mean his heart was cold to what had just happened. Honorius had abused his authority as emperor to arrest the woman for one single purpose, to lure Marcellus out of hiding so that he may claim his head. Unfortunately, this did not go as planned. Marcellus had resisted the demand to hand himself over. Knowing full well the kind of character a petulant man. Child like Honorius had. If he had gone peacefully to Honorius, the man simply would have killed his mother before his very eyes, before having him beheaded. Naturally, he would not give up his life so willingly, and because of this, he had marched an army on Ravenna, abandoning his duty to protect the empire's borders as he did so. Had Honorius just left well enough alone, Marcellus would have waited until spring to raise a rebellion. The foolish emperor could have lived and reigned for another few months. However, that was no longer the case. Marcellus would have the man kneeling and groveling before him this very day. He had already enacted a plan to do so, and his best soldiers were already underway enacting this covert operation. Meanwhile, Marcellus was rallying his soldiers beneath his command, filling them with the same unyielding rage that he felt at this very moment. Venom-laced words were spat from his mouth as he condemned not only Honorius but every man who swore loyalty to him as a traitor, as a murderer, and as a subhuman rat. These animals, the so-called men who still defend this city, they murdered your families, just as they have murdered mine. If you think your wives and children went to the afterlife peacefully, guess again. These corrupt, wicked, sinful bastards most likely played with them first, because that is what they are, monsters. I look upon many of you, and the men hiding behind these walls like the cowards they would call you barbarian. Why? Because you are not Roman. Let me ask you this. How many of you would hold a defenseless woman captive for months, starving her, beating her, and ravaging her? Go on, tell me, how many of you would behave so monstrously to an innocent soul? Despite the fact that the barbarians' tribes engaged in plenty of atrocities during their raids, these men were not like the Goths under Alaric's command. Savage wolves of Germania who preyed on all who were unfortunate to get in their way. These men were more like the domesticated hounds who served honorably beneath their Roman masters. Or as honorable as a Goth could serve. Because of this, the men shouted back their condemnation of the enemy. Monsters. Savages. Those who cower behind these walls are the true barbarians. With this, Marcellus unleashed his sword from his sheath and pointed it into the sky towards the city of Ravenna. When those gates open, you show no mercy to the monsters who defend the false emperor. You kill them, just like how they have killed your families. The horde of 30,000 Gothic foederati resounded in the air, almost as if they were a massive pack of wolves howling because they had caught the scent of blood. The city of Ravenna, and all the soldiers who defended it, would face the wrath of Germania on this night. While Marcellus was rallying the troops, and encouraging them to engage in a massacre, Ordius led a century of the most battle-hardened legionaries of Marcellus' army. These men snuck through the postern that was left open by Placidia during her escape. Apparently, the fire set to the grain storage that she had started had yet to be put out. It was only after the 80 men had made their way through the postern that they locked it behind them, believing it would be best to conceal their presence. Ordius commanded his soldiers once they were inside. Act naturally, as if you're a patrol being sent to the gate to reinforce it. As far as the enemy is aware, we are a part of their forces. The men all nodded their heads with grim expressions as they slowly marched towards the nearest gatehouse, where much of the enemy forces stood alert, waiting for the morning to come so that they could fight against the rebel army that had gathered outside the city. When the century of Marcellus' legion arrived at the gate, the man in charge immediately questioned them. Where did you men come from? Why are you not at your post? Ordius did not panic and immediately made up a story that was believable on the spot. Do you not see that fire burning back there? You think this is an ordinary fire? It is an act of sabotage. Enemy agents have infiltrated the city and set fire to our food stores. The Magister Militum has ordered the Palatini to reinforce the gates while you men go and put out that damned fire. Hurry, quickly, or we will all starve long before the barbarians break through our defenses. The general in charge of the gate's defense did not even question these orders. If their grain storage was really on fire, and had been burning for the past few minutes, then the whole city was in danger of starving. He quickly ordered his soldiers to follow him towards the grain storage and put an end to the fire. All men, on me. Our food stores are burning. We must put out that fire as quickly as possible. When the soldiers defending the gates heard this, they panicked just as much as their commander and sprinted towards the burning food stores as fast as possible, leaving the gate entirely defended by an enemy force. Naturally, the moment they were out of sight, Ordius gave the order to his men. Open the gates. They did not even need to hear the order as they were already opening the gates without any resistance. While a few men worked the winch that operated the gates, Ordius and his army formed a shield wall that protected them, so that no man could interfere. Luckily, the commander of the wall's defenses was easily scared, because there were no men within this sector of the wall remaining on guard. Before long, the gates were opened without the slightest bit of conflict occurring. When Marcellus saw the gates opening, he ordered his army of 30,600 men to charge the city. Charge! Kill them all! He was the first to spring towards the gates after adorning his gilded helmet. The Roman general rushed towards the opening gate, which was hundreds of feet away from his army, while a horde of Gothic warriors and Roman legionaries followed him into the fray. The other sections of the wall immediately noticed the entire rebel army converging on the one sector of the wall and were immediately confused. However, it was too late. The gate was already open and the Gothic horde had entered the city. The defending army quickly rushed to the breached gate, but it was no use. They were too few. The moment the Goths flooded the streets, they began to massacre anyone unfortunate to be outside on this night. As far as their orders were given, they were to consider anyone still on the streets to be an enemy combatant. Because of this, a few unfortunate civilians were caught by the Goths and butchered where they stood. As for most of the people, they heard the war cries of the Goths as they flooded the city and hid within their homes. Marcellus took the lead as he stormed with his legions by his side, directly towards the palace. With his spada in one hand and his scutum in the other, he pressed forward against the loyalist forces, with no fear of death in his heart. The lines of the palace guard and the rebel legion clashed directly outside the residence of the emperor. Marcellus plunged his blade into the depths of a loyalist Palatini's guts, piercing through his mail armor and into his innards before ruthlessly ripping his blade out of the hole and kicking the man to the ground where he was trampled to death by the rebel forces. While this was occurring, Honorius watched from the palace balcony in horror as the city fell around him. Marcellus' words, as he screamed at the top of his lungs, sent chills down the man's spine. Honorius! You bastard! I'm coming for your head. Honorius could only stare in disbelief as his palace guard were rapidly cut into pieces where they stood, severed limbs, and penetrated bodies bleed all over the steps of the Roman palace. It was clear as day to the man who, just hours before, believed he could still achieve victory. Ravenna had fallen. Chapter 55 Deposing an Emperor. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Marcellus clashed with what remained of Honorius's personal bodyguard. While he and his legion fought side by side against the enemy forces, Honorius was nowhere to be seen. He had long since abandoned the balcony in fear that an arrow might claim his life. However, the rebel general did not care. Instead, he used his sword and shield to reap the lives of the men in front of him, who slowly but surely fell by the wayside. He could not count how many necks he had stabbed through, or how many mail shirts he had penetrated by sheer brute force. Mail armor was virtually invulnerable to slashes, but against piercing strikes, the links of the chain were liable to break. Especially with enough force. It was far from an easy task to pierce through a male's shirt with a spada. However, Marcellus was in a berserker rage. His stamina no longer had an effect on him. He had but one goal. Claim Honorius' head, and kill any one man who came between him and his objective. Thus, as he ripped his Noric steel blade out of the chest of another palace guard, he did not hesitate to thrust at his next target. Slowly but surely, the wall of bodies between him and the entrance of the palace were whittled away until all that remained were 3 men who valiantly stood in front of the opening, refusing to yield. Marcellus rushed towards the leader of the 3 men with his shield, knocking him off his feet and into the entrance of the palace. The other 2 men by his side tried to target Marcellus, but they were too slow. The other legionaries who bared their blades against the remaining palace guard quickly surrounded them. Multiple steel swords penetrated through the bodies of these men, claiming their lives on the spot. Meanwhile, Marcellus was already driving his blade into the eye of the last man who dared to defend Honorius. With the palace guard eliminated, nothing stood in between him and his goal. Marcellus screamed in a voice so loud that it echoed throughout the entirety of the palace. "Honorius, Olympus, you cowardly bastards! Show yourselves and submit to my fury." To Marcellus' surprise, his targets revealed themselves. Olympus held a blade against Honorius' neck and tried to pin the blame on everything that had happened on him, as if this indolent fool could possibly be the architect behind Stilicho's demise. Like the weasel he was, Olympus shook in fear as he tried to find a way to escape his predicament. "General Marcellus, I have the culprit right here. He is the man who ordered Stilicho's execution and kidnapped your mother. I was merely followed orders as the Magister Militum." Marcellus glared at Olympus with a hate-filled gaze. However, the man did not turn and flee, instead he was frozen in spot, petrified by the sight of his enemy. Marcellus slowly walked towards the duo who were now surrounded by his legions. Surprisingly, the moment he arrived in front of Honorius, Marcellus did not kill him, rather he knocked the fool unconscious with the pommel of his spada. Before Olympus could respond to this shocking situation, Marcellus had bared his blade against him, driving the tip of his spada into the man's groin, completely destroying the man's reproductive organs as he did so. Olympus fell to the ground in tears, howling like a castrated beast. "You fiend!" However, Marcellus did not care the slightest for the man's insults and instead pressed the heel of his foot onto the man's head, crushing his jaw. "You really expect me to believe that Honorius was the mastermind behind your sudden rise to power? You fucking serpent, killing you would be a mercy. For all that you have done, death is too easy. Instead, I will see the skin flayed from your bones. I would like to see how long you can still draw breath under such torment." After saying this, the legionaries beneath Marcellus's command did not hesitate to apprehend the castrated senator. Meanwhile, Marcellus gazed at the unconscious Honorius and spat on his face. After doing so, he issued further orders to his men. "Throw this one in the dungeons. I will show this fool no mercy. He will come to understand the pain my mother went through in her final days, because I intend for him to suffer the same torment. From this day, until the day he finally croaks, the false emperor Honorius shall be beaten, raped, and starved until his body finally gives out from the abuse." The means that Marcellus had planned to dispose of his rivals shocked the Roman legionaries. However, the next words that their general spoke caused their hearts to shake with trepidation. "As for any man that has sided with these monsters who still draws breath, crucify them. Show the people of Ravenna what happens to those who dare to defy my rule." With this, the city of Ravenna was now under Marcellus' command, and the false emperor Honorius had been deposed. As far as the Western Roman Empire was concerned, the Theodosian dynasty had come to a bloody end. However, that did not mean in the slightest that his rule was absolute. In the West, Constantine and his revolt still posed a threat to the Roman heartland. As for how Marcellus planned to deal with Constantine and his forces, there were 2 paths to take. He could reconcile with the man and proclaim him company emperor, uniting the Western Roman Empire and its armies together. However, this was troublesome, as it would provide Constantine with equal power, and the man would undoubtedly get in Marcellus' way as he tried to bring the empire back to a state of glory. Not only that, but he would have to fear constant assassination attempts from the man. It was more trouble than it was really worth. However, the only other option was to defeat Constantine in battle, something that Marcellus had failed to achieve in the past. Even if he defeated Constantine, it would come at a heavy price to his own army, and in the end, he would likely have to fight another campaign in Hispania just to end the Theodosian loyalists who were currently in a war against Constantine and his forces. Both paths to unification had their pros and cons, and at the moment Marcellus could not decide on a course of action. As for the second crisis that Marcellus was facing, in the east, Alaric and his Goths ran wild, pillaging, raping, and raiding their way across Rhaetia. Whether they were smart enough to realize the value in the tools Marcellus had left behind, that remained to be seen. If they were, then that could cause a whole new series of troubles to arise. To deal with Alaric, Marcellus faced two paths, very similar to Constantine. He could fight them in battle and defeat them. Yet how many of his Gothic foederati which his army relied upon would side with him against Alaric, he did not know. The other major concern was that Alaric was a capable commander, and unlike Constantine, outnumbered him. The only other option than open warfare with the Goths was settling their matters peacefully. In order to achieve this, Marcellus would have no choice but to allow the Goths to settle in Illyricum, Noricum, and most likely Rhaetia as permanent residents of the empire. However, undoubtedly, Alaric would refuse to accept the Romanization of his people, as the Goths had done in the past, creating long-term future conflicts. Still, in the short term, Marcellus would gain access to the Gothic forces as additional foederati, which would buy him the strength he needed to maintain his control over the Italian heartland until he could build up his own forces to the extent that he no longer relied on the foederati. Such a path forward was probably the best for the short term, but had unforeseen consequences that could prove catastrophic in the decades to come. If facing Alaric and Constantine weren't enough, Marcellus had just created a third crisis that he would have to resolve in some fashion. With Marcellus successfully deposing Honorius and subjecting him to the cruelest of deaths, the Theodosian dynasty, which still ruled the Eastern Roman Empire, would not simply look the other way. Nor would they ever consider Marcellus as a legitimate successor to the Western Roman Empire. Undoubtedly, Marcellus would have invoked the wrath of Theodosius II, or more accurately, his mother. Unlike the West, the Eastern Roman Empire was wealthy beyond measure, and their armies were not worn down by constant warfare. At least not to the extent of their Western counterparts. Nor were they facing a rebellion. As a result, the East could easily send an army into Marcellus' territory and make his life a living hell. There were two options to deal with the Eastern Roman Empire. One of them was unrealistic. He could meet the Eastern Romans in Illyricum, drive them from the province and claim it for himself, but he would have to first find a way to deal with the Goths. The likelihood of him having the military ability to achieve this was almost zero. The only other option was to bribe the Eastern Roman Emperor into appeasement. Again, this was difficult, as the majority of Western Rome's wealth had just been spent in a ransom to Alaric. However, by bribing the Eastern Roman Empire into not attacking him, or at least delaying their invasion of the West, Marcellus could buy himself enough time to deal with the other two immediate threats. How he proceeded going forward would determine if his rule would last 3 months, or 30 years. If he took one wrong step, his life would be over, and so too would the hopes of restoring Rome to its former glory. Upon dwelling on this, Marcellus merely smirked, thinking upon his idol and the difficulties he had to face upon ascending to the throne. It would appear that he was destined to follow the path of Aurelian, or die trying. Chapter 56 A Question of Alliances. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Following his victory in Ravenna, Marcellus found himself an emperor. However, his empire was divided, and facing many threats on its borders. Luckily for him, Constantine was fighting a war in Hispania, and word had not yet reached the region of Honorius' demise. Nor had it spread to the Eastern Roman Empire. Marcellus had a very finite amount of time before he faced a three-prong invasion from Constantine's rebellion, the Gothic hordes under Alaric, and the Eastern Roman Empire. If such an event were to occur, his reign would last a matter of months. Because of this, Marcellus was forced to choose an ally from among the three. Despite sharing a similar culture and heritage, the Eastern Roman Empire was not an option. They were ruled by Honorius' nephew, and as a member of the Theodosian dynasty, Theodosius too would never forgive Marcellus for deposing his uncle, nor was he likely to recognize Marcellus' rule as legitimate. Thus, immediately off the bat, one of the three viable alliances was taken off the table. Which left two unlikely, but not impossible, allies. Constantine III, or Alaric the Goth. Marcellus currently sat within his war room, listening to the differing opinions of his officers. Sarus was the first to express his views on which ally they should side with. Constantine is a snake. He cares not for the prosperity of Rome, but for his own personal vanity. Should you make the man your company emperor, he would betray you at the first opportunity given to him. Only despair can result from such a union. Since Constantine cannot be trusted, there is only one viable solution to our problems. Alaric, and his Gothic horde, currently occupy the dioceses of Noricum and Illyricum. If you win over his favor, and allow the Gothic people the rights to freely settle the lands they currently occupy as part of your empire, you will gain an army large enough to defeat your two foes. Stilicho was already in the process of working with Alaric to gain his support so that he could retake Illyricum from the east. However, these plans fell through. Alaric knows you are Stilicho's godson. He will trust you more than your predecessor if you give your word to him. It won't be easy to convince him because of your reputation as a famous Goth slayer. However, if you succeed, Alaric and his horde will join you as foederati. With the full might of the Goths by your side, you will have a better chance of dealing with your other enemies. Marcellus sat perfectly still, not saying a word. This discussion was open to all who were present, and thus the other officers beneath his command were allowed to speak up with their own ideas. Primus was quick to counter Sarus's point. If you allow the Goths to settle in the dioceses of Noricum and Illyricum, as Goths and not Roman citizens, the other dioceses will revolt. Everyone else who is a part of our empire had to go through the process of Romanization. Why should the Goths exempt from such a thing? Sarus merely scoffed before responding to Primus' counter-argument. Because, unlike us Goths, you Romans conquered all of your other subjects and forced them to submit to your way of life. Do you dare say that in your current position, you have the ability to conquer the Goths, legatus? This line of reasoning stumped Primus. It was true that if they were letting the Goths settle into Roman territory, then it was bound to be a matter of peaceful negotiation. If anything, Rome was the one being conquered in their current situation. Marcellus watched the interaction between the two officers before sighing heavily in displeasure. If he really thought about it, aligning with Alaric was, without a doubt, the best short-term solution. However, Rome had let the Gothic peoples enter their territory and settle their lands before. In the end, the Goths rebelled and killed the Roman Emperor Valens in the Battle of Adrianople. Granted, that was the Eastern Roman Empire, but the point was still valid. If Marcellus accepted Alaric and Sarus's hordes into his lands to settle, who is to say that in 10, 20, perhaps 30 years they did not turn their blades against their masters? Unfortunately, Marcellus did not have the luxury to think about the long-term consequences of his actions. He could only focus on getting out of his current predicament and dealing with the fallout later on. As a result, he sighed once more before coming to a decision. Send a delegation to Alaric and his forces, request that they cease their advance into Rhaetia, inform them that I am open to negotiations about settlement into Roman lands, and that I seek an audience with Alaric in person. I would request that we meet in neutral ground, but unfortunately, I don't believe such a place exists, so I am willing to meet him at the border between Italia and Rhaetia. As Sarus has said, Alaric is our only viable option, and if we wish to survive the coming storm, we must align with him. After saying this, the multiple officers of Marcellus' army reacted differently. Sarus was pleased with Marcellus' choice. Though he had never been fond of the man, he did respect him. Now that Marcellus was emperor, perhaps the rift between Roman and Goths could be mended. For how long such an alliance would last, even Sarus did not know the answer. As for Ordius and Primus, they were displeased. They would rather trust in a rebel like Constantine than a barbarian like Alaric. At least Constantine was a Roman citizen. However, Marcellus did not feel the same way. He had witnessed the scheming ways of the Roman people. If anything, the barbarians were far more simple to deal with. Promise them wealth, and women, and they will follow you to the ends of the earth. Romans were far more conniving, and could betray you over the slightest matter. After coming to a decision, he dismissed his officers. Marcellus had much to prepare for and had not even had the time to grieve his mother's loss. With everyone absent, Placidia stealthily approached the room. After his mother's death, Marcellus had not said a word to the girl. She knew the cruel fate that awaited her brother, but she felt it was well deserved. She did not hold it against Marcellus for being so ruthless to the man. Instead, she was depressed that Marcellus would not even look at her. As if he blamed the girl for his mother's death. After several days of this torment, she could not hold back, and forced Marcellus into a situation where he had to speak with her. "Marcellus, we need to talk." The man was in the middle of pouring himself a cup of wine when he heard the girl's voice come from behind him. There was nowhere for him to escape to. The girl stood at the only exit to the room he was in. He took a sip before casting his gaze towards the map. This only increased Placidia's anxiety, causing her to snap. "Marcellus! Why won't you look at me? I risked my life to help your mother escape. I did everything I could to get her in your arms. Men died to help us escape. Do you blame me for her death?" In response to this, Marcellus sighed heavily before responding to the girl's question. Though he would not look at her, he decided it would be best to tell the girl the truth. "I don't blame you for my mother's death, Placidia, I just can't look at you without remembering her last moments. Please, leave me be. I need time to grieve." After saying this, Marcellus averted his gaze from the young woman, and returned it to the map in front of him. He took a large swig of the red wine. However, unlike what he expected, the girl did not leave. Placidia was stubborn. She quickly latched onto Marcellus' back, refusing to budge in the slightest. If Marcellus would not look at her, then she would say something that would force him to do so. "You're not the only one who has lost his loved ones over these past few months. How do you think I feel? First my brother dies, then my other brother murders my foster father, and finally the man I love killed my last living relative. If anyone understands the grief in your heart, it is me. So please, don't bottle up your emotions. Talk to me." Marcellus did not know how to react to this news. Did the girl just confess to him? It was a pity. If she had said something months ago, perhaps his heart would have fluttered. However, at the moment, he was truly dead inside. Even the time he spent in Siegfrieda's arms could not invoke an emotional response from his withered heart. He simply stood there in silence, with Placidia's arms wrapped around his back. Even still, he did not glance at the girl for a single moment. The young woman burst into tears when she realized that Marcellus still would not look at her. In the end, Marcellus pushed the girl aside and spoke the words in his mind with a deadpan expression on his face. "You should go. I have work to do, and little time to do it." Placidia was heartbroken by Marcellus' lack of response to her feelings. She simply ran off crying, not knowing what more to do. As for Marcellus, he gazed into his goblet of wine and witnessed his own reflection. He did not know why, but looking at his own face caused a sense of revulsion to appear within his mind. In response, he swept the golden chalice aside, spilling its contents all over the floor. After doing so, he left the war room. As he had told the girl. There was much work to do, and little time to do it. Chapter 57 Purging the Senate. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Days had passed since Marcellus ascended to the throne, and in this time he had been busy drafting a plan of national defense against the many enemies he had created. While Marcellus was busy enacting emergency measures to stabilize the realm, the surviving senators had gathered in the sacred halls of the Roman Senate to discuss their next move. Among the dozens of men gathered, one was an elderly man who had served in the Senate for many years. His name was Albinius, and he gathered the men before him to resist the rule of this new self-proclaimed emperor. Now that the empire was in chaos, it was time to restore the former powers of the Senate, or so he thought. Thus, he spoke with passion about his vision to the other senators. General Marcellus has marched his armies into Ravenna, and slaughtered the emperor and those who are loyal to him. He has an army of 6,000 Romans and 30,000 Goths at his back. However, he does not have the support of the patrician clans, or the plebeians, for that matter. What I suggest is simple. The moment Marcellus stands before us and demands we pass an act of legislation, we stand united against him. Show him we, the Senate, hold the power in Rome, and that he is merely our puppet. After all, he may control the armies, but it is we who control the coin that pays them. When placed in a position of payment, or loyalty, naturally the men who follow him will shift to our side. Another senator was quick to object to Albinius' decision. Marcellus has proven himself a capable commander, who is loyal to Rome itself. We do not need to threaten to turn his men against him. We just need to show him that his interests should align with ours. If he understands Rome is better off under our rule, he will surely give up his power. Your actions will force his soldiers to choose between their general and payment. Such a thing will only end bloody for all of us. Despite this, Albinius and the other senators were unconvinced. Instead, the elderly senator made an assumption based upon Marcellus' current actions and coerced those who remained undecided to his side. Marcellus has the intention to declare himself a dictator, and use his power to restore Rome to its former glory or his perceived notion of such a thing. He will not see reason, as he believes the path to salvation is through tyranny. If we do not make our stand here, then the empire is doomed. It was at that moment that a certain sound interrupted the secret meeting. It was the sound of a slow clap, followed by a familiar voice. Very good, Albinius. It seems you have seen through my intentions. Now that you all know of what I have planned, I suggest you cooperate with me. After all, it is in the best interests of Rome and all its citizens to serve its new emperor. My first act as emperor is to declare mandatory conscription of all able-bodied men aged 16 to 20. They shall serve in my army for a minimum of 4 years. You don't have a problem with this, do you? After all, we need soldiers if we are to defend what little ground we have left. The senators gazed at the origin of the voice and witnessed Marcellus descending into the Senate chamber. Alongside him was the legion of men he had trained at Castra Regina. As for the forces who once comprised Primus Limitanii, they were busy undergoing training. The senators spoke among themselves as Marcellus' forces slowly surrounded them. Those who were previously undecided were now wavering in their newfound convictions. Ultimately, Albinius was the one to act defiant as he chastised Marcellus for his intrusion in the Senate. You may hold the title of Emperor Marcellus, but you are not a dictator. You do not have permission to come into these chambers while we are discussing matters of state. Nor do you have the right to compel us to follow your orders. Soldiers of Rome, I will remind you that though your loyalties are to the emperor, it is we in the Senate who pay you. I suggest you keep that in mind before you do anything that you will regret. The Senate has decided, and we feel it is best, that power resides in the hands of elected officials, rather than a usurper. Marcellus gazed at his soldiers, who did not waver upon the mention of payment. Instead, they stood firm as they awaited the orders of their emperor. Upon seeing this fierce loyalty, Marcellus smirked arrogantly before asking the entire Senate where their loyalties lay. Do you all feel this way? The overwhelming majority of the senators nodded their heads while grumbling, as for the rest they remained silent in fear of retaliation from their fellow senators. After witnessing Marcellus so boldly declare his intentions of assuming power, even those who were on the fence before now found themselves defiant. Upon seeing that the Senate's decision to resist him was unanimous, Marcellus sighed heavily before snapping his fingers. In the next moment, the legions who stood by his side formed a shield wall surrounding the senators and unsheathed their blades. The senators reacted with panic, just as Marcellus had expected them to, with Albinius cursing the mad man who proclaimed himself emperor. "What do you think you are doing? Do you really believe you can intimidate us into obeying your whims?" In response to this, Marcellus merely chuckled as she shook his head. Did these fools really think this was an act of intimidation? This was their execution. He toyed with the senators for a little while before giving the command to end their miserable lives. "Albinius, you are mistaken. I do not seek to intimidate you and your fellow senators into obeying my whims. I seek to exterminate you all. There is no need for a senate filled with corruption. Whatever gods you may hold in your hearts, I suggest you pray for their mercy, for you shall receive none from me." After saying this, Marcellus snapped his fingers and his soldiers immediately thrust their blades into the bodies of the unarmored senators. Screams of agony filled the air as blood spilled into the halls of the Senate. Marcellus gazed upon the blighted scene with disdain. One by one the senators fell to the blades of Marcellus' legion until finally only Albinius remained. The man had his stomach punctured and was bleeding out on the floor as he cursed at the new emperor. "That, you fucking madman. Do you really think you can rule Rome without a senate? The people won't stand for it." Marcellus unsheathed his blade as he walked over to Albinius with a sneer on his face. His words would remain in the minds of those who acted as a witness for years to come. "It is because of you Christian fools that the empire now finds itself on the edge of extinction. Had you allowed the altar of victory to remain, none of this would have happened." After saying this, Marcellus swung his sword down towards the senator's neck, decapitating him on the spot. Having done so, he wiped the blood which coated his blade onto the man's tunic before sheathing it. Ordius gazed at Marcellus in disbelief. Did this man really just condemn Christianity in the halls of the Senate? Marcellus glanced at Ordius with an expression that stated his mindset. He did not care in the slightest about his antagonistic remarks towards the Christian religion and instead issued orders to the soldiers beneath his command. The corruption that has plagued the Senate for centuries has now been purged. As of this moment, I, Emperor Titus Claudius Marcellus, declare myself the sole authority in Rome, and hereby order the conscription of all able-bodied males aged 16 to 20 into my army. As for the Senate, I hereby announce its disbandment until a time where Rome is stable and prosperous. When the Senate finally returns, so too will the altar of victory to its rightful place. Are there any objections? The soldiers beneath Marcellus' command shook their heads in response to this question. Though the vast majority of them were Christian, and Marcellus' declaration of restoring the altar of victory was sacrilege, they did not dare rebel against him. After all, the 30,000 Goths at his back would clearly turn against them should they put their faith in God above the glory of Rome. With the Senate purged, Marcellus returned to the palace. Despite the conscription of his forces, he would need many months to train and equip these new soldiers for war. In this time, his enemies would realize his circumstances and march against him. Thus, the need to join forces with Alaric was still paramount. Nothing had changed. Rome was still at the brink of annihilation, and only by making a deal with the devil could it save itself. Chapter 58 The Grief of a Son. You are listening at novelfull.audio. With the Senate purged, and the armies under his command, Marcellus had declared himself emperor and dictator, to act as the supreme authority in the Western Roman Empire until a point where the political situation could be stabilized, and the realm became prosperous once more. Immediately there were concerns among the patricians, and plebeians alike, as to the extents Marcellus would take to ensure his vision of a glorious and untied empire. However, after what happened to the Senate, few, if any, were willing to voice them. A messenger had been dispatched to Alaric, seeking to come to negotiations. While this was occurring, conscription had been enacted and tens of thousands of young men were rounded up from their homes and placed into military service. Despite a lack of personal funds, Marcellus had seized the wealth of the senators he had killed and used it to fund the expansion of the Roman army. He had also used a portion of this newfound wealth to fund the expansion of the empire's agriculture. While winter was approaching, and the techniques he had dreamed of would not be useful until the next year, it was best to spread word of these agricultural reforms to the farmers, so that they can best prepare themselves for next year's crops. Currently, the territory that Marcellus had under his control was Italia, and North Africa. Everything else was either occupied by barbarians or rebels. The Limitanii who protected the frontiers were the only forces capable of rebelling against Marcellus' rule. However, they did not act in any threatening capacity, instead they stayed in control of their regions, and followed Marcellus' order. As far as they were concerned, it was a good thing that a more capable man had deposed Honorius. Thus, at the moment, Marcellus found himself spending whatever free time he had with his lover Sigefrida, who did her best to tend to the wounds in the man's heart. With his mother's death, he had little time to grieve, and could only bottle up the myriad of emotions he felt. Currently, the Suebi beauty was bathing with her Roman master. She was washing his back to the best of her ability while trying to comfort him about his recent loss. "Marcellus, you know I don't mean to pry, but I feel as if I can't stay my tongue any longer. You need to speak about your mother. What happened to her was a tragedy, but you can't keep bottling up your emotions like this. Please, speak to me." Perhaps it was because of the amount of wine he had consumed on this day, or perhaps it was because of the soothing sensation of his bath, but the moment Sigefrida spoke these words, Marcellus' mind was consumed by the grief that he had sealed away deep within his heart. He struggled to choke back the tears in his eyes. Sigefrida noticed this and wore a bitter smile as she hugged the man from behind, her large bosom pressing against his bare back as she did so. Despite the euphoric sensation, Marcellus was not the least bit excited and instead broke into tears. He had broken the one rule he had set for himself since the moment he learned of his father's death many years ago. He swore to himself that he would never again cry in the presence of another living being. However, at this moment, the memories of that time when his mother comforted him flooded his mind. Yet, she was not here to comfort him in this moment of grief, for she was the cause of it. As if he was a small child, Marcellus cried, and cried, turning from his position and shoving his head into the substantial bosom of his lover, seeking comfort in her warmth. Sigefrida had a comforting smile as she stroked the man's soaked brown hair. There, let it all out," Marcellus whimpered like a wounded child as he called out the phrase over and over again. "Mother! Why? Why did you have to die like this?" Sigefrida knew Marcellus better than anybody. These past few days, he had been putting on an excellent facade. Revealing only strength to his followers, however, such a mask would inevitably crack sooner or later. It was better for the new emperor to let out his tears in private among a trustworthy companion than to break down in public. Though the previous emperor was officially declared dead, the reality was he was being kept alive in the dungeons, where he was beaten and raped daily. Honorius was force-fed only enough food and water to keep up his suffering. Eventually, he, like Aeliana, would die from his circumstances, but it would be many months before the fool finally croaked. Despite condemning the man to such a fate, Marcellus did not have the strength of heart to visit his prisoner, because if he did, he would only associate the vile acts with what his mother had gone through. Even Placidia was unaware of her brother's fate, believing the lies that Marcellus told the public. That Olympus had slain the former emperor in an attempt to curry favor with the rebel general so that he might save his own skin. Most knew Olympus' personality, and they did not question this lie. Because of this many people did not blame Marcellus directly for Honorius' death, but saw him as responsible since Olympus had only acted in such desperation because he was cornered. It was because of this that Marcellus had hopes of bribing the Eastern Empire into staying their hand. Should they learn of Honorius's actual fate, there would be no repairing that relationship. Only blood would appease the Theodosian dynasty. Marcellus and Siegfrieda stayed in the bath for some time. He had many tears to cry out, and should anyone intrude on his breakdown, it would ruin his reputation. It might even harm the authority he had carved for himself. After the man was no longer capable of crying, he exited the bath with his lover. She latched onto his side like a lamprey, afraid that the slightest blow to his current mental state might drive him to do something foolish. As a result, she stated to the guards that he wasn't feeling well, before leading Marcellus into the bedchamber. She did not plan to take advantage of his weakened state to do anything sinful. Instead, she climbed into the bed with her master and merely cuddled with him, hoping that she could provide some comfort and speak to him about important matters. "Marcellus, I don't know what you said to Placidia, but you broke her heart. You know that you and I can never be together, at least not as a married couple. You are an emperor now, and you will need to think about having an heir soon. Placidia may be a bit young, but in a couple of years she will be of age to marry, and I can think of nobody better than her to be your wife. When you are feeling better, you should approach the girl, and apologize for whatever it was that you said to her." Marcellus was silent for several minutes as he reflected upon what the woman had said. He rested his head on her substantial breasts as if they were the fluffiest of pillows. Ultimately, he broke the silence and revealed his thoughts on the matter. "Placidia is like a little sister to me. However, she is of the Theodosian dynasty. If I marry her, I could claim some legitimacy to the Western throne. Especially if we have an heir together. There are many who call me a usurper behind closed doors, and are looking for any excuse to depose me. When news spreads of what I have done to Hispania, it will spark another revolt. Or perhaps they will side with Constantine to overthrow me. If I wish to secure their support, then marrying Placidia would be a good first step. I guess I have no choice but to apologize to the girl. After all, she did confess her feelings to me, and I said nothing." Siegfrieda did not respond, and simply caressed Marcellus' head. She was fine being his slave lover. That was all she ever really desired in life. However, she knew Marcellus would need a proper wife, and she was certain that Placidia would tolerate their relationship. It was one of the reasons she was insistent on the idea of the two marrying. She finally spoke one last phrase of encouragement to Marcellus before the man drifted asleep. "My heart bleeds for you, Marcellus. You have so many burdens to carry, and I can only do so much to help. Today, you can cry as much as you need to. However, tomorrow you must move past this grief and look towards reforging an empire that is on the brink. That I know your mother was important to you, but you know she is in a better place now. She is in the fields of Elysium, enjoying the peace that the gods have given her. So rest now and recover your strength. You will need it for what lies ahead." After hearing this, Marcellus drifted into a deep sleep. He would dream about his childhood, where he and his mother were able to live happily under Stilicho's protection. This solemn dream would allow him to say goodbye to the woman properly, even if it was only in his mind. The next day, his vigor would be renewed, and though the pain of his mother's death would still linger in his heart, it would no longer cripple him emotionally. Siegfrieda was right. He would need to move forward from this tragedy if he wished to save the empire from its fate. Chapter 59 Convincing the Gothic King to Negotiate. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Alaric stood in the villa of Castra Regina. The stronghold had been abandoned, and as a personal slight to the man who ran away from his duties, the Gothic king had made it his personal abode during his stay in Rhaetia. The area had been evacuated, and thus there were no women for him and his men to enjoy. While Alaric sat back and feasted upon some salted pork, a messenger walked in through the door. He was a Roman who was escorted by Alaric's elite Gothic warriors. When the barbarian king gazed upon the man, he broke out into a fit of laughter. "So, Honorius finally has come to his senses and sent someone to negotiate with me. Come, sit down, enjoy my fire, and my boar." Despite the welcoming gesture, the Roman messenger did not accept. instead he had a stern expression on his face as he informed Alaric of a shocking revelation. The false emperor Honorius is dead, betrayed by his own Magister Militum. In his place Titus Claudius Marcellus has proclaimed himself emperor. The new emperor requests to meet with you on the borders of Italia. He intends to negotiate with you and your people about permanent settlement of the lands you currently occupy. The room was filled with silence after the messenger had said these words. The Goths were in a state of disbelief. For many reasons. Firstly, Honorius had so suddenly been deposed, but second, the idea that the infamous Goth slayer had risen to the position of emperor and was now requesting to settle their disputes peacefully was mind-blowing. Alaric could hardly believe it. He stood up from his seat, towering above the Roman messenger while staring at him with an intimidating glare, before interrogating the man on whether he was lying. You come into my abode, and tell me that Marcellus the Goth slayer is now the emperor, and that he wishes to negotiate with me and my people for settlement of the lands we have conquered. Why? He has put tens of thousands of my people to sword, men, women, and children have all died by his hands, and now he wishes to extend an olive branch to us. I'm not buying it. This has to be a trick. The Roman messenger bowed his head, too afraid to look into the barbarian king's eyes. He mumbled a single name as he tried to convince the man of his emperor's genuine interest in ending their squabble. Sarus. When Alaric heard this, he roared, before striking the messenger across the face with a furious backhand. Sarus. That petty coward. He has long since bent the knee towards his Roman masters. Does he think I will do the same? After receiving a firm slap to the cheek, the Roman messenger calmed himself as he tried to explain the full situation to the best of his ability. Sarus and his men have pledged their allegiance to the new emperor. 30,000 Goths follow Marcellus and his legions into battle. The emperor has promised them lands to settle in Noricum and Illyricum. He wishes to extend that offer to you, and your people as well. Alaric chuckled. He could hardly believe his ears. If Marcellus of all people was willing to negotiate with the Goths, then he was truly desperate. However, he knew the Goth slayer well enough to know that he was not doing this out of the kindness of his heart. There had to be some underlying conditions. Thus, the barbarian king was quick to voice his concerns. What exactly does Marcellus ask of me, in exchange for this newfound kindness of his? The Roman messenger did not have an answer to this, and quickly voiced what he had been told. I don't know. I'm just a messenger, not a diplomat. He requests you meet him at the borders of Italia and Rhaetia. He has given you the location of the meeting ground on this map. Negotiations will take place there. The emperor requests that you arrive with a delegation of your choosing and he will do the same. Both parties will maintain security, with 500 men each. Whether or not you choose to show up is up to you. After saying this, the man was escorted out of the room and back to his horse, where he and his convoy rode back to the city of Ravenna. As for Alaric, he was standing next to his advisors. He gazed at the map and the location where the meeting was supposed to take place. He was convinced that this was a trap, but was keen on the insight of the men by his side. What do you think? Is the Goth slayer being sincere with this request? Or does he seek to eliminate us in one fell swoop? A Goth who wore the skin of a wolf was the first to voice his opinion on the matter after carefully thinking about it. If Marcellus is the new emperor, then it means he laid siege to Ravenna and deposed Honorius. This would explain why he and his forces withdrew from Rhaetia and abandoned the province to our conquest. It would appear that he was fighting a rebellion, though what madness convinced him to march to Ravenna without preparations is beyond me. By usurping the Western Roman throne, he has created many enemies. Even if he were to do something desperate, like a widespread mandatory conscription, his forces would not have enough time to become proficient in warfare before his enemies marched on him. If what the messenger said is true, he is relying on his Gothic federati to maintain order over his crumbling empire, and to dissuade hostiles from approaching the Italian heartland. If all of this is accurate, then I believe he is acting in good faith towards us. Simply because he has no other options. Once news of his successful rebellion reaches the east, the Eastern Roman Empire will want his head, and if it spreads west, Constantine will press his claim against a weakened empire. If I had to guess, he intends to make peace with us, in order to rope us into his federati. With Sarus and your forces combined, he would have a sufficient force of battle. Hardened veterans to keep the enemy at bay long enough to restore his forces. It's a bold move and relies entirely on whether or not you will keep your word. Alaric scoffed when he heard these words, condemning Marcellus for his foolishness. Does that little boy really think we will obey the whims of the Romans as if we were some trained hounds? We are the wolves of Germania. It is not in our blood to be bound to a master. Sarus is a coward for obeying the Romans. It is clear that their time has come to an end. The same warrior who wore the wolf skin was quick to interject with Alaric's thinking and provided a voice of reason when it was desperately needed. With all due respect, my liege, I think you should reflect on our position. With each passing year, the winters grow colder, and with it, the north becomes more difficult to survive in. In addition to this, you know of what menace lies to the east, and is pressing forward towards Rome as we speak. If we wish to survive these troubling times, it might be in our best interest to temporarily align with the Romans. Marcellus sounds keen on allowing us to settle Noricum. He will probably use us to take Illyricum back from the east. He will also be relying on us to defend the territory we are given to settle. As long as he doesn't force us to become Romanized like the other subjects of the empire, we can practically become our own client state. I think we should at least meet with him to see what he has to offer us. We can always scout out the location beforehand to ensure that we are not walking into a trap. If you think there is the slightest sign of a ploy against us, we can leave before we become ensnared. Alaric thought about these words deeply, before asking the rest of his advisors for their opinions. What do you all think about this? The various advisors to the Gothic king spoke their pieces, but after extensive debate, they all agreed that perhaps they should entertain the negotiations. After all, they shuddered to think of what would happen to them when the Eastern menace finally caught up with them. With this Alaric had decided, he would meet with Marcellus and see just what this new self-proclaimed emperor had planned for him and his people. Time healed all wounds, and sometimes necessity was the harbinger of powerful alliances. Both Marcellus and Alaric found themselves in desperate situations. It was because of this that Marcellus had put his faith in the Goths, rather than in the rebel Constantine. If he could come to an agreement with Alaric, perhaps he could prevent the cruel fate that awaited Rome, at least for a little longer. Chapter 60 Negotiations at the Italian border. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Marcellus rode on horseback. He clutched the hilt of his sword, expecting conflict at any given moment. Why was he so on edge? Because he was about to meet with the man who had long since been a thorn in the empire's side. A man he had fought a battle with in the past, a man who he could consider a true rival. With Stilicho gone, Marcellus no longer felt confident in his ability to beat Alaric. It was a good 50-50 chance that he would come out on top should the two men and their armies engage in mortal combat. At the moment, he was traveling to the Italian border to meet with the Gothic king, in a rather poor attempt to lure him to the side of Rome. Alaric was a proud man, who commanded a significant army. Marcellus could not rely on bargaining from a position of power, as both men knew the victory of any conflict between the two of them was up to a coin toss performed by the gods. Marcellus was anxious because he did not know whether these negotiations would result in a brilliant success, or a bloodbath. Naturally, he was the first to arrive at the agreed location, where he and his men dismounted from their horses and took cover in an old, abandoned fort. Little did he know the Gothic host had already arrived and was merely waiting to see if he had showed up in good faith. When the scouts saw Marcellus had arrived with the agreed-upon forces, they reported this news to Alaric and his advisors, who were slightly surprised. Alaric scoffed when he heard this before making a comment on Marcellus' actions. It appears he really is desperate. Let's see just how much he is willing to concede in order to gain our allegiance. After saying that, the large barbarian king galloped down towards the destination where the negotiations would take place along with his men. Like Marcellus had said, he brought 500 men to act as security on his behalf. Alaric had done the same. When Alaric entered the room along with his advisors, Marcellus stood up, though he did not immediately move to greet him. The two men were locked in a battle of stares as they waited for the first man to flinch. This lasted for several moments before Sarus interrupted the contest with a crass remark. "Are you two going to compare the size of your cocks all day, or can we move on to more important matters?" While it may have been crude, it was effective, as the two leaders immediately broke their stares and focused their gazes on Sarus, who merely smiled and took a drink from his wineskin. After coming to their senses, Marcellus and Alaric took their seats across from each other at the negotiating table. Marcellus would not hide the truth from Alaric. It would be easy for the man to confirm the situation for himself. Thus, he was completely honest as he opened his negotiations. "I won't lie to you, Alaric, I have inherited a throne that I cannot easily keep on my own. Honorius, in his ever-foolish state, had driven the empire to the brink of collapse. I need men to fight for me, if I wish to maintain what ground I have gained, let alone reunite the empire. If I had a better option, I would take it. However, as things stand, the Theodosian dynasty wants my head. Constantine will surely press his claim the moment he realizes the state that the Italian heartland is in, and you are on my northern borders, threatening to raze everything to the ground. I am prepared to offer you, and your people, permanent settlement in the lands you currently occupy. Namely Noricum and Illyricum. In exchange, all that I ask is you pledge your loyalty to me as my federati. For a period of 5 years, I will not tax you, and your people, as my subjects, so long as you answer the call to arms when it is required. After this timeframe is over, you will pay normal taxes, but you are not required to convert to Christianity, nor will you be required to become Romans." It shocked Alaric and his advisors to hear these conditions. This was better than what they were hoping for. Alaric himself was truly doubtful. He believed that the self-proclaimed Roman general was deceiving him. He wanted to know more about the situation in Rome before deciding on a course of action. "What forces do you have right now? If I am settling in the empire and committing my men to fight for it, I damn well better be sure that we are not the only ones fighting." Marcellus showed his hand as he revealed what paltry forces he had at his disposal. "Currently, I have 6,000 men in the Italian heartland, who are a true legion, formed from the Limitanii of Rhaetia. They are heavily armored and heavily trained. Among these 6,000 men are 500 cataphracts. I also have the armies of North Africa at my disposal. If I were to count them, I'd say it is another 6,000 men. I have begun conscription, and have another 50,000 men who are undergoing training as we speak. In a few months, they will be a fearsome force who can respond to any threats that my empire may encounter. On top of this, I have 30,000 Gothic federati who have already pledged their loyalty to me. That means I have 80,600 soldiers who can defend my borders. More than enough to halt your advance into my lands, should I be forced to do so." Alaric chuckled when he heard this claim before pointing out the flaws in Marcellus' reasoning. "If what you say is true, then why do you need my men so badly?" In response to this, Marcellus took a sip from his wineskin before explaining in great detail his reasons for recruiting the Goths. "Firstly, as I said, 50,000 of my men are undergoing training, and are waiting to be armed and armored with the best equipment I can manufacture. Second, unless it is absolutely necessary, intend to leave my second legion in North Africa to secure the province. Should you invade, I will be forced to withdraw them, abandoning North Africa to its fate, but doubling my military capabilities. Lastly, you are not the enemy who I need to face right now. I would rather not bloody my forces in battle, expelling you and your ilk from my lands. Without sufficient training and equipment, much of those 50,000 conscripts would perish, and I would prefer they form into proper legions before sending them to war. If I can make peace with you, and add your forces to my army, then it is far better for us all than should we come to blows. You know my offer is the best you are going to get. So stop acting coy, and answer me already. Will you submit yourselves to the service of Rome as my federati, and in doing so, gain fertile lands for settlement? Or will you continue to raid, and ravage the Balkans, where you will eventually be surrounded by the combined might of the Eastern Roman army, my armies, and of course, this Eastern menace I have heard so much about? I am sure even the mighty Alaric won't be able to prevent the annihilation of his people against those odds. It shocked Alaric to see that Marcellus knew about the threat that was rising in the east and was quick to inquire about what he knew. You know about them? A hint of surprise appeared on Marcellus's face as he gazed upon the fear that mired the mighty Gothic king's visage. He was honest about what little he knew about this eastern menace. After all, if Alaric knew more than him, he could easily call him on his bluff. I have only heard rumors, but I know they are really out there, and pose a far greater threat than you do. If either of us wishes to survive the coming storm, then we need to work together. I suggest you put aside your grudges and consider what is best for your people. You know you can't continue your nomadic existence without eventually being whittled down into nothing. Join me, and perhaps we can not only reunite the empire, but even expel this threat to the east before it drowns us all. Alaric gazed over at his advisors. They seemed to be more fearful of the eastern menace than he was. The idea of having Rome as an ally against this threat was reassuring to them. Though the Western Roman Empire may be a shadow of its former self, to the Germanic people, there was still an ancient terror hidden behind their name. Marcellus was living proof that the Romans weren't entirely extinct just yet. After careful deliberation with his advisors, Alaric stood up from his seat and reached out his hand. The action slightly surprised Marcellus, but it did not take him long to accept the gesture. The two men clasped each other's forearms as they stared into each other's eyes. Marcellus was the first to speak. Whether we be Goth or Roman, our futures lie intertwined from this moment forward. We either succeed in our endeavors and drive our enemies from the borders of the empire, or die together against the overwhelming odds that seek to crush us. Either way, from this day forward, you, Alaric, king of the Goths, are my brother. Alaric broke out into uncontrollable laughter as he heard this remark. He never in his life expected the infamous Goth slayer to say those words to the king of the Goths. After hearing it, he pulled out a mug and made a declaration of friendship. I can drink to that. With that said, the Romano-Gothic alliance had been established. For how long it would last, nobody really knew. However, for the time being, Marcellus had gained tens of thousands of battle-hardened warriors to add to his ranks. Whether it was Constantine in the west, or the generals of Theodosius II in the east, he was confident that he could now hold his ground against his many enemies.